Hello and welcome. In this episode, I share a collection of stories from people who aren't quite sure what they encountered. These stories are some of the creepiest I have come across, which include a group seeing an eerie, unmoving figure in the woods that mimicked their friend's voice perfectly that later followed them back to their cabin. A poster who had a dream about a creature his father saw in real life that he feels like is stalking him. And people who encountered humanoid creatures that left them afraid and searching for answers. But first, we start with a girl who took her dogs out one night only for something to try and lure her into the woods. Also, if you'd like to help support the channel, click on the join button below. Alright, let's get to today's stories. The first story of this episode is one that involves something in the woods that the original poster, or OP, is unsure of what it was. This encounter takes place in Maine and happened when the OP was on her annual summer trip to a camp in Dedham, Ellsworth, Maine. Her family stayed in a log cabin overlooking a lake. She notes that the camp is approximately an hour drive from the nearest town, so it is located in a rural location. Her family owns the camp and she has been going there her entire life, but this is the first time she has ever encountered anything like what she did on this particular trip. She was 18 years old at the time. One night during their trip, the OP was up in the middle of the night watching TV. Her parents and brothers were already in bed. She heard something in the kitchen and realized that the dogs needed to go out. The dogs included her brother's 2 pit bulls and her Affenpinscher, which she says is a very small dog. She mentions how incredibly dark the woods are in Maine. When she took the dogs out, she turned the porch light on, but it didn't light up much more than the porch. She took the dogs out into the yard, took their leashes off, and did her best to keep an eye on them. She got distracted for a second by a loon, which is a bird, by the lake, and when she looked back at the dogs, the pit bulls were staring at something in the woods. She couldn't see what they were looking at, but dismissed it as a squirrel or a raccoon. Only then did she realize that her dog, the very small one, was nowhere to be found. To make matters worse, her dog is black, which made it near impossible for her to see. She called her dog a few times and heard whimpering coming from the spot her brother's 2 dogs were staring at. She started toward the spot thinking her dog had gotten its paw stuck or something like that, but made it no more than a couple of steps when she felt something move behind her. Startled, she spun around and saw her dog. She had been right beside her the whole time. The OP just couldn't see her. Her first thought was that if her dog was right beside her, then what was that in the woods? Curious, she took another step toward the spot where the whimpering had come from, but the pit bulls started growling and slowly advancing toward the dark woods. The OP isn't exactly sure what she thought she might find, but says there are a lot of animals in the area it could have been. She trusted her dog's instincts and turned around to head back to the house, but as soon as she did, she heard something she describes as the most bone-chilling thing she has ever heard in her life. A voice emanated from the woods calling her dog's name. It sounded like it was trying to mimic her, but it felt wrong in every way. It was distorted and almost sounded like something wailing. Extremely freaked out by this, she turned and ran inside with the dogs. She still has no idea what was in those woods that night. There are a number of cryptids that can mimic not only human voices but other sounds as well. Trying to lure her into the woods is common for several types of cryptids. Without a visual sighting or description of whatever was out there, it's hard for me to venture a guess as to what I think this might have been. However, given that she was in Maine, I'm kind of leaning toward a Wendigo here. I am drawn to stories that involve the tactic employed by the cryptids capable of mimicry. It always sends a shiver down my spine. I don't think it would be something fun to experience though, to say the least. What do you think was trying to lure this poor girl into the woods that night? The next story comes from a poster who was encouraged to post his story online by a friend because it sounded similar to urban legends regarding skinwalkers and Goatman. He had never heard of either until looking them up online, but has since read and listened to a lot of stories. While he is from England, his encounter takes place in Colorado. He had always wanted to travel to the United States and got the chance when he and two of his friends saved up and traveled to Colorado to go rock climbing. They took their trip in 2012. They had traveled through Colorado Springs to Walsenburg and ended up west of there in a small town close to the New Mexico border. They found the small town by making some friends in Denver who were also explorers, as he puts it, and asked if the OP and his two friends wanted to join them on their camping trip. There ended up being a total of 8 people in the group. The first 2 nights of the trip went off without a hitch and ended up being great. On the third night, the OP and 4 other members of the group went for a walk through the forest to take in the amazing views. While walking, the OP saw what looked like a deer on the trail and turned to get his friend's attention, but when he turned back, it was gone. At the time, he thought he made too much noise and scared it off, but a few minutes later, he saw the deer again. Except this time, it didn't look quite right and looked to have more fur than a normal deer. The way it moved didn't look right either, almost like it was a man trying to walk on all 4s. He became so focused on the deer that he didn't even notice the pungent stench that had filled the area until his friend said something about it. He describes it as smelling like blood and death, but feeling warm and metallic. He asked his new friend from the States if there was a factory nearby, but there wasn't. The OP mentions he has a strong stomach due to growing up on a farm, but says this smell was horrible and stomach-turning. They all decided to head back to the cabin then, but 10 minutes into their return trip, the OP sees the same deer off to his right. This time it stood up on its hind legs. He called the group's attention over to the strange sight and they saw it too. But one of his friends laughed and said it looked like a person, while another friend wondered if another group was out there too. The OP was adamant that it was the deer from earlier now standing on its hind legs, but the group looked at him like he was crazy because what they saw was clearly the silhouette of a person standing with their back to them. His friend called out to whatever was standing there, but no reply came. He called out again, but again there came no answer. Then the whole group shouted at the figure asking, "Are you okay?" That's when they got their answer. A familiar voice called back, "It's Richard." The reply was soft but was loud enough that they could still hear it. Except Richard was supposed to be back at the cabin. Again the figure called out, "It's Richard," and the OP says it definitely sounded like him. Another of their friends told him to stop messing around and the group continued walking. But no more than 10 seconds later, the OP looked back and the figure had completely vanished. He says there was no way it had time to run off. When they got back to the cabin, they found Richard there with their other 2 friends, both female, who were making dinner. One of the friends told him not to leave the girls again because he was the only one back at the cabin with them to keep them safe. But Richard said he had been there the entire time. The group who went for the hike laughed like he was joking and said that they had seen him in the woods and that the figure in the woods had even said it was him out there. Richard looked them dead in the eye and said he hadn't left the cabin, and the 2 girls confirmed this. The OP and the others who were out there with him shrugged it off as a joke, so they carried on with their evening and eventually went to bed. The OP woke up really thirsty at around 3 a.m. and needed something to drink. He immediately noticed upon waking that the rancid smell was back, and says it was probably the smell that woke him up in the first place. He went to the kitchen to get some water when he heard something rustling outside. It sounded more like something was out there crawling around rather than walking. He turned the porch light on, but this did little to help. However, he did see something standing about 20 meters away at the edge of the forest. Standing there motionless with its back to him was the silhouette of a figure. He immediately went and woke up everyone, and one of his friends went to the front door to get a better look. Pretty soon they were all gathered around the open door and trying to make out whatever this thing was. One of the guys had a maglite torch and shined it on the figure, but it still didn't move. Another of his friends yelled at it, but still, it did not move. This raised some alarms with everyone, so they turned to go back inside when they heard, "It's Richard." Everyone looked at each other and then they all looked at Richard. The OP says he doesn't think Richard can throw his voice, but the figure sounded exactly like him. The voice was his and he did not speak in that moment. Chaos ensued then and no one knew what to do. No one went back to sleep and they all waited for the sun to come up, which felt like a lifetime. They constantly checked outside and Richard and his other friend held their rifles the rest of the night. When the sun mercifully rose in the morning, they got out of there as fast as they could. This is one of the creepiest stories I've come across in a while. To see a motionless figure standing in the woods only to hear a familiar voice come from it would be beyond unnerving. And to have it follow you through the woods only to show up at your cabin later that night? That's the stuff straight out of a horror movie. The smell that accompanied the creature is something that a lot of people encounter with cryptid sightings, and the way he said it was so bad it made him feel ill is a common description of just how pungent and rancid these smells are. Given their close proximity to the New Mexico border, I think they could have been dealing with a skinwalker here. To see a deer, then see it stand up on two legs, and then a figure who can mimic the voice of someone they know, certainly points to a skinwalker from me. What do you think they saw that night? The next three stories come from the same post where people detail their encounters with humanoid beings, but aren't sure exactly what they came across. Like so many others, they have turned to the online community for answers. The first of these stories comes to us from Scotland, where the original poster thinks they could have encountered a fleshgate in a park one night. If you've never heard of a fleshgate, it is another term used to refer to Goatman. He posted his story on a few forums and was eventually led to the Fleshgate stories, where he shared what happened to him in hopes that someone could help him figure out what he saw. He does not say where exactly his story takes place. The story begins with the OP and his friend hanging out in the park one night, smoking and doing normal teenager things. It was during winter when it got dark early and there was very little lighting in the park. It was somewhere between the hours of 11 p.m. and midnight. There was an area of the park with swing sets, so they headed over there so they could sit down and smoke. But they got no more than 10 feet away from the swings when they were hit by this smell. The OP describes it as rancid and making him gag. The boys joked about the smell and quickly dismissed it as they continued on their way to the swings. But the smell got a lot stronger, so the OP started looking around to see what could be the cause. His gaze was then drawn to a bench sitting in front of a wall that was about a foot high. That's when he saw what looked like a humanoid figure squatting down behind the bench. He describes it as being naked, hairless, a pale whitish-grayish color, and being about 4 to 5 feet tall while squatting. He estimates that it would have been at least 8 feet tall while standing. The boys stood there staring at the creature for a moment before looking at each other as if to ask, "You see it too, right?" Then they heard a giggle emanate from the creature that sounded like that of a 4-year-old girl. It was then that the boys got out of there as fast as they could, running like their lives depended on it. When they got far enough away and stopped in a well-lit spot, they sort of laughed it off and went home. The OP still gets shivers down his spine thinking about it, but his friend seems to have forgotten about their encounter. However, the OP refuses to return to the park at night. He ends his post by asking if anyone knows what he and his friends saw that night. When I first read this story, my first thought was Crawler, but then I read the part where whatever this was giggled like a 4-year-old girl. Now, I'm not sure what to think about this one. Wendigo are close in appearance to crawlers and can mimic humans, but they aren't in Scotland. I know crawlers can make some disturbing sounds, but I haven't heard of them being able to mimic humans. I think the boys did the right thing by getting out of there when they heard this thing laugh like it did. That would have been the creepiest thing to hear, especially coming from the thing they saw it coming from. And the smell coming from it? As I mentioned in the previous story, this is a very common thing when encountering cryptids. What do you think about this one? The second of these humanoid encounters comes from a poster who saw something they describe as a pale humanoid they initially thought was a panicked stray dog. But it had these huge glowing eyes and it was moving in a very unnatural way. He describes the being as having strange proportions, looking emaciated, and having no visible fur or even ears, at least from the vantage point he was looking at from his stopped car. He was trying to zero in on this thing and get a better look at it, but had a hard time seeing it because it was moving so fast and through shadowy areas along the street he was on. He says the first thing that came to mind was a ghoul and that the being was approximately 4 feet tall while on all fours. He says the limbs were so long that it could have been extremely tall standing on its hind legs, but unlikely that it would have reached a height of 8 feet. He says the closest images he has seen that look the most like the creature are the pictures of the rake and the sketch of the Dover demon. I'll put them up on the screen so you can see what they look like. He goes on to say that he sketched what he saw and the sketches that he drew look most like the Dover demon. I know the picture of the rake was created for fictional stories and the Dover demon is an urban legend. But it's funny to me, and not in a humorous way, how many of these cryptids resemble urban legends and mythical creatures. Kind of makes you wonder if those legends and myths are fictional after all. As for what he saw, his description makes me think crawler. The physical appearance and height definitely match, along with the way it was moving and how fast it was running. What do you think he saw that night? The third of the humanoid encounters and the final story of this episode once again involves a dream of a being that was also seen in real life. The original poster has only seen the cryptid in a dream once before, but his father has seen the creature in the waking world while walking on a trail in the woods. He does not say where his story takes place. In the OP's dream, he is meeting a friend in an area he refers to as the Wastes. It was late afternoon, early evening, and the sun had begun to set. He and his friends began cooking some food, and as they finished cooking, they found themselves in complete darkness. They started fumbling around for their belongings in the dark, but decided it would be a better idea to set up some shelter immediately as coyotes would be drawn to the smell of the food. Using his phone for light, they began walking a trail that is similar to the path he takes to reach his usual camping spot in real life, which is in the forest where his father has seen the creature. But the terrain was different in his dream. There were no trees, but instead just rock and ash. They came to a cliff wall, and that's when the OP saw a light coming from what looked like a mine shaft. He and his friend had the idea to take shelter in the mine shaft, so they started heading that way. When they reached the entrance, they were standing at the top of what he describes as a slide leading down into the mine. The OP realized then just how dark the mine was. They treaded carefully for fear of tripping, and that's when he saw a crumbled corpse by the entrance. Then he saw a second one just inside the mine. The OP froze in place and saw something inside the mine walking toward him. It was a thin silhouette that was as tall as he was, which is 6'4". Fear nearly consumed him as he watched the creature slowly approach him and his friend. He told his friend to back up and fumbled for his phone, turning on the light and shining it on this being. The creature quickly shrank away from the light, crouched down, and darted off into the darkness farther into the mine. That's when he woke up. He says he is hundreds of miles away from where the dream took place, but he still does not feel like he is alone at night. The OP goes camping a lot in the forest where his father physically saw the being. He has never seen it himself other than in his dream, but his father said it felt like it was going to attack him. Just like in his dream, his father shined a light on the thing and it ran away without delay. He says it has all the features that people normally use to describe skinwalkers and fleshgates, or goatmen. The OP has had the feeling while in the forest that something is out there calling to him, like it wants to separate him from the group he is with. He has gone to his normal camping site with the intention of staying overnight by himself, but he can never bring himself to do so. He has felt this thing watching him out there and somehow just knows it's either the same thing his father saw or another just like it, because the feeling his father got when he saw the creature is the same one he gets in his gut while he's out there. He goes on to say that when he is normally in a dangerous situation, his adrenaline kicks in and he usually doesn't feel afraid. But when he thinks about this being, there is no adrenaline, just a vulnerable feeling and an overwhelming fear. Despite everything, he has the strong urge to meet this thing and feels like it wants something from him. He says in the pursuit of life's meaning and knowledge, he would be willing to give it to this creature. He ends his post by saying he is thinking about going out and camping alone and asks for people's thoughts on this. I've said this before and I don't mind repeating it. I would strongly advise against seeking these things out, especially when they seem to have malicious intent. His father said he felt like this thing wanted to attack him when he saw it. This makes me think it is up to no good and has bad intentions for the OP. For some reason, it has taken an interest in him, and I can't see a scenario where the result of him coming face to face with this thing would end well. As for him having a dream about the creature and it being seen in real life, this is just another example that seems to suggest cryptids being able to mess with our minds and our dreams. Ordinarily, I would dismiss the dream as him having it because his father told him about the creature and described it to him. But the fact that he feels like it's watching him, wants to draw him away from his group, and wants something from him makes me think otherwise. If I were him, I would stay away from this creature. What do you think? And what do you think this creature might be? And that's going to do it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed these stories. If you'd like to hear more stories like these and other types of cryptids, make sure to subscribe to the channel. If you want to send me your story, I'd love to read it. My email is wolfwhocriedcryptid@gmail.com. I will also put it in the description below. With your permission, I may want to use it in an episode. Even if you'd prefer that I didn't share your story on my channel and just want someone to listen, email me. We can privately talk about your encounter. And please remember to keep it civil in the comments section. No one deserves to be ridiculed whether they believe or not. Thank you for listening. I'll catch you at the next episode.